With Frank's words fresh in his mind, Tom had to act, whether it was for the sake of his mentor or just himself. Tom ran through the streets in a desperate need to reach his destination. His workday had finished, and as far as he was concerned, so was his unbelievably mundane life. Tom slowed as he came up on the police station. Tom straightened his tie and headed inside to start his excavation of the truth. Once inside, Tom only wandered a few seconds before he stopped the first officer that had caught his eye. "Excuse me, where are you holding Robert Tillman?" Tom poked out his chest and brandished his uniform. The officer responded with a puzzled look. "Do you know where they're holding Robert Tillman?" Tom repeated his question, with a great deal of grit in his words. "Well, of course I know where he's being held, but I don't know if you have security clearance to speak with him." Tom's brow quickly arched. "I am your ship's captain. I have the highest security clearance on this damn ship. Now you're going to let me into his cell so that I may ask him a few questions. You are welcome to join us if that'd make you feel better." Tom stayed firm. Without further hesitation, the officer took Tom straight to Robert's cell. He jimmied with his keys in the cell door a bit before it swung open. For the first time in years, Tom laid eyes on the now infamous Robert Tillman. Tillman's green eyes looked puzzled at the sight of Tom. The features in his dark skin seemed to sink from obvious exhaustion. The wrinkles in his 42-year-old face showed a prominence that seemed to double his age. With his hands cuffed behind his back and his ankles cuffed to the chair, he made little efforts at movement. Assuming that this was some new interrogation tactic, Robert chose to sink his eyes deep into his gray jumpsuit. Tom sat in front of him and rested his hands on the table. "Hey, Robert. So I know this will seem, well, odd, but you worked in the library for 14 years, right?" Robert remained silent. "Didn't you spend the last 5 of those years working specifically within the library's archives?" Yet another question Robert chose to ignore. "Look, man, this silence isn't making you seem any less guilty, and I really just need your help. I need to see the ship's manifest and mission data, which I believe to be kept in a little black composition notebook." Robert's eyes grew large and his mouth dropped, but he still said nothing. "You see, no one in the library knows the archives as well as you. I was really hoping you could help me find them rather than forcing me to search through the entire archive. So what do you say? Will you help me out? I can get you a square meal or something." Tom waited a few moments, but Robert's silence remained unbroken. Tom rose from his seat and stormed out of the precinct. Tom headed off to the library, hoping to find something he was uncertain to have ever been there, much less still be there now. Frank's words still bounced about in Tom's head. These words were unusually haunting for Tom because he wanted nothing more but to find the truth, even though at this point he was afraid of what the truth may uncover. Nevertheless, he knew he couldn't rest until achieving some level of closure. Was Frank spewing some newfound truths or just some confused delusions? Up until a few hours ago, Frank D'Angelo was just Tom's crazy old mentor. Now Tom was on a vengeful mission with the hope to restore his mentor's good name. He knew the only way to do so would be to produce the proof that was kept within these documents that Tom somehow had looked over all these years. Tom let himself in the library. As he entered, all eyes looked to him. The once silent scene erupted into a cloud of whispers. He headed straight for the front desk. The librarians began to hurry through the lines so that they could get to Tom. One librarian stood up straight and adjusted the wide white frames on her nose as Tom approached. After waiting his turn in a rather short line, Tom approached the counter and greeted the librarian with a smile. "How can I help you, Captain Tom?" The librarian gawked. "I require access to the archives. If you could please fetch the keys for me, that'd be amazing." Tom leaned against the counter, eager to commence in his search. The librarian left her station and was back with 2 sets of keys in her hands. "Would you like for me to escort you into the archives, Tom?" The librarian waved her keys about as she smiled with batted eyes. "That isn't necessary. I know my way back, thank you." Tom snatched the keys and was on his way, leaving the librarian to tell her coworkers all about what had just happened. Tom began rummaging through the library's archives, focusing on documents that captains would only have access to. Tom ransacked the captain's archives. He threw papers and booklets all over the floor. His fingers feverishly fished through all of the familiar documents, but he eventually slumped into the floor as he reached the end. He was crushed by the force of disappointment. He hadn't found any evidence of the missing document's existence. With it, hopes of proving Frank's truth faded as well. Tom willed himself back to his feet and began rifling through the general archive. He knew very well that he wasn't going to find whatever he needed there, but he had to be certain. After having shuffled papers all through sundown, Tom was now growing irritated as he began to reconvince himself of Frank's deteriorating mental health. He gazed across the archive floor in horror of all the pages he had scattered about them in his madman's rage. He began to wonder if this whole plight would cost him his mental stability. Tom thought it would be best to clean up his mess and sleep on the issue that teased him. After having spent more hours on cleanup than he possibly could stand, Tom was finally ready to call it a night. He sat at the round table in the archive room, gathering his thoughts. He took a glance at his chrome watch. The watch read 12:13 a.m. Tom began to gather his belongings and prepare for his exit. But just as he raised his head from his watch, something caught his eye. An empty folder in the captain's archive. He stared blankly at the curious detail. A detail he had overlooked how many times at this point? He cracked a bit of an unsteady smile as all the realizations rushed into his brain. The empty folder was filed between the ship's main control system and the ship's maximum capacity. Although he couldn't be certain, Tom had convinced himself that the document originally filed between those two must have been the ship's manifest. That was the only explanation Tom could give for why a folder would be left empty in the middle of the captain's archive. Someone must have emptied it and taken its filing tab down to cover up their tracks. Just as Tom had given up on his mentor's mental state, yet another lead brought Frank's theories crawling back from the grave. Tom got up from his seat and rushed back into the main library to get some assistance from the librarian. But as soon as he reemerged, he quickly realized that wasn't going to happen. Due to the incredibly late hour, all the library staff had gone home. The library was dark and stunningly quiet as Tom walked about the empty rooms and hallways. As he planned his next move, he realized how late it was and how tired he felt. He revisited his original plan and went home to sleep on his newly gathered information. It was now just past 1 a.m., and Tom laid in his bed, tossing and turning along with all the thoughts in his head. He was now frustrated since he had to be up for work at 7, and it didn't seem as though he'd get an adequate amount of sleep. All the activities from his day had wound him up, and he was having major troubles winding back down. He'd shuffle around a bit, look at his clock, and see that another 10 minutes had been flushed down the toilet. Finally, after 40 minutes of tossing about, Tom began to doze off to sleep. He was awakened by red flashing lights. Tom looked around his room, confused, but it didn't take him long to realize what was going on. He sat up in his bed and could hear the emergency siren ringing through the town's PA system. He put a robe on and went outside. He had no need for lights, as the town's emergency lights were bright enough to light the whole room a lovely tomato shade with each flash. His neighbor's eyes immediately sought after him, hoping for answers. Tom chose not to meet their eyes. Instead, he chose to stare at the sky dome and study the red pulse. The siren died down, and a voice soon took its place. It was required for all emergent situations to be explained through a PA announcement. "Sorry to wake you." A soft female voice rang through the PA system. "We've officially lost the last member of our initial launch team. Captain Frank Wemley D'Angelo passed away tonight at the age of 93. We would like to respect his passing with a brief moment of silence." Such a moment was never allowed to exist. Just as the emergent situation concluded and the sky dome displayed night once more, the city was flooded by the cries of all the souls touched by Frank D'Angelo. Fighting tears himself, Tom looked about the neighborhood, seeing man and woman alike falling out at the loss of their beloved leader. Cries could be heard from miles away, and for a solid 10 minutes the entire town cried for their loss. With it now being 5 a.m., Tom had just about given up on and chose rather to help his neighbors cope however he could. The next day was very gray. It was astounding to see just how many people Frank had touched in his long lifetime. As Tom walked his way to the jail, he could just feel the loss in the air and on the faces of so many people. This really made Tom rethink his time thus far as captain. Had he touched even a fraction of the people that Frank had in his time? Will he ever be able to touch that many people? Could he really be that different from his mentor? These thoughts haunted their way through Tom's head as he walked. He began to wonder what it might look like when it was his time. Would they wake the entire town up with an emergency broadcast to announce his passing? Will they even still be on this ship by the time he passes? In only 48 hours, Tom had experienced more excitement than he had in all 17 years of being a captain. He knew that with the conditions of Frank's death, the excitement wasn't going anywhere anytime soon either. He sat in an empty interrogation room waiting his turn to be questioned. He had been summoned by Sheriff Basil earlier this morning. He used his walk to the jail to clear his mind. Sheriff Basil came marching into the cell door after only a 3-minute wait. His keys jingled at his hip as he walked. His gold badge's fresh polish gleamed in the spotlight. Despite the sheriff's friendliness, Tom always finds himself intimidated by the bulky stature and broad shoulders. Sheriff Basil stood at 6'6" and was built like a tank. "I understand that you're a busy man, Captain. Today, more than ever. So I'll try and keep this quick. The sheriff's deep tones bellowed through the small cell as he took his seat. According to the visitor log, you were the last person to visit Frank. Did he say anything that might make you think he was capable of taking his own life? No, nothing. Our visit was very routine. He resented his Alzheimer's diagnosis as usual, but he seemed to truly love life. I still personally don't believe he took his own life. That man was a lover. Look at all the people he touched. His room is practically flooded with flowers now. That's an awful strong accusation, Tom. Do you realize that if it wasn't suicide that makes it murder, that would be the first murder in 72 years, Tom? With a police force such as ours, I find it highly unlikely. Sheriff Basil leaned closer into Tom's face. Unless, of course, you know something that we don't, Captain. Tom could tell that Sheriff knew more than he was letting on. I realize that, Sheriff. But the man was my mentor, and I can't help but feel as though I know him a bit better than most, especially towards the end of his days. I will stand by the fact that I don't think he did it. Tom stuffed some emotion into his words. I can understand how you feel, Tom, but with all due respect, I'm going to have to ask you to keep those thoughts to yourself. We don't want to start panic. I'm sure you understand, Captain. The sheriff spoke with a cold face. Perhaps you can use your passion to aid in the investigation. If you know or learn anything, please be sure to take it back to us. The sheriff broke a gentle smile. Of course, Sheriff. We work together to keep Hope safe. That will never change. I wish I had more evidence to offer up from our conversation, but I really haven't got anything. Tom rose from his chair, anxious to leave. Sheriff Basil halted Tom with a single hand gesture. I'm glad to know that we see eye to eye, Captain, but I'm afraid I have a few more questions to ask before I can conclude this interview. Tom swallowed hard when his attempt at an early exit had failed. Now, Frank's attending nurse at the time of your visit said that your visit lasted significantly longer than usual. In fact, she overheard Frank getting rather belligerent with you. Perhaps you can shed some clarification to these odd behaviors noticed by his nurse. Sheriff Basil spoke with a smug smile that just slapped Tom right in the face. Oh yeah, it was a long visit for sure. We just had a lot to catch up on, you understand. You can ask his attending nurse as proof. That was the first time I had visited him in a couple months, so we had a lot to talk about. As I had mentioned earlier, he resented his Alzheimer's accusations. When I tried to reinforce him, he got very belligerent with me. I wouldn't be surprised if the whole nursing home heard him. Tom casually smiled back as his lies bounced off the sheriff's face. I see. But you do admit to these actions being out of character for Frank, correct? The sheriff stood up again and began to walk around the room. Well, yes, it was very out of character for Frank to get that loud with me. Tom hadn't quite realized that he had fallen into the sheriff's trap. Now, when I asked you earlier, you said your conversation was very routine and that nothing out of the ordinary happened. However, now I learned that Frank had gotten very loud with you, which I now know is out of character for him. I can't help but think that you aren't telling me everything, Captain. Sheriff Basil continued to casually walk around the room as he spoke. I said he didn't say anything that would lead me to believe that he was suicidal, and if you don't mind, I must be going now. I have much to do rather than waste my time sitting around here being interrogated. Tom rose from his chair and approached the exit. You are free to leave, Captain. No one is keeping you here. But if you think of anything that I should know, please do swing by and tell me. Sheriff Basil was satisfied with what he had deduced. Tom hurried through the exit, anxious to flee. He was followed close behind by Sheriff Basil, who wanted to keep the pressure on, but the sheriff's stride was stopped when he realized that there was others in the area who could help him with his suspicions. Officer Stokes, come here, please. Sheriff Basil called out to the nearby officer. Yes, Sheriff? What do you mean to do, sir? Officer Stokes stood at the ready for his task. Yesterday, you had mentioned to me that you had let the captain into a prisoner's cell, is that correct? The gears in Basil's head were turning rapidly. Yes, that's correct, sir. What prisoner did he speak to? Sheriff Basil questioned. He spoke with Robert Tillman, sir. The sheriff's face lit up with that news. Robert Tillman. Things are getting interesting indeed. Officer Stokes, spread the word. Captain Tom is not to speak with any prisoners without me accompanying him. Yes, sir. The officer responded and then was quickly off to spread the new gospel. Tom spent the remainder of that day in and out of meetings and press conferences, detailing the circumstances of Frank's death and his public funeral plans. He became embroiled with yet another hot topic, the public place that would display Frank's urn. Traditionally, the ashes of the dead would be spread through space via the ship's ventilation system. However, it was unanimously decided that Frank's ashes would indeed be kept in an urn and left as a shrine in his memory. And the school, library, and Capitol building were all popular votes for the urn to be kept. His public remembrance service was to be held that Sunday at his originally issued home where he lived until moving into the nursing home. All citizens were encouraged to share stories, or to express themselves in any way they felt necessary at this event. Frank's death weighed heavily on Hope, but they were determined to celebrate his life rather than wallow in his death. This day wasn't busy just for Tom, however. Don had to be present at every one of these meetings and press conferences, yet as usual, he was not given the chance to speak. It was an eternity for him to be a silent attendee for all of these gatherings. Sheriff Basil didn't have it much easier either, as he had to deal with countless false claims surrounding the circumstances of Frank's death. All in all, anyone having any sort of societal influence or leadership had a rather rough day filled with bizarre encounters. It was 9 p.m. The Sky Dome displayed its starry night sky. The sheriff sank into his chair in his rundown office as he pondered the events of the day. He felt the ridges in his wood desk as he attempted to clean up all of his theories he had deduced that day. Between suspicious citizen disputes, nursing home scandals, and of course his new topic of interest, Captain Tom's actions, Sheriff Basil's mind hadn't stopped racing since he walked into the station that morning. Even now it was past time for him to go home, and his thoughts buzzed circles around in his head. Suddenly, he was interrupted by one of his lab boys barging in through the door.
"What the hell, Tony? Ever hear a knocking?"
Sheriff complained as he sat up in his chair. "Sorry for the interruption, sir, but we just got some reports back from the labs, and we have to pass this information on." Tony spoke with a great sense of urgency.
"Well, I'm not stopping you. Spit it out."
Frank did not commit suicide. In fact, we have concrete proof that points more towards foul play. The sheriff sprang from his chair. The lab boys and your investigators analyzed the entry and exit wound on the victim, along with the hole in the wall in which the bullet hit after exiting. They're confident he was shot in a way that isn't physically possible for someone to do themselves. Tony stood proud as he could tell by the look on the sheriff's face that his news made a dent in the sheriff's thinking.
"I see. And who all knows this now?"
Sheriff Basil sank back into his chair as his theories raced around once more. "Only you, myself, the lab boys, and a few of your investigators." Tony's voice jittered.
"Good. Let's keep it that way. This investigation needs to proceed on an as-need-to-know basis. And I'm the only one who may determine who needs to know."
The two men stared awkwardly for a few moments as separate thoughts raced through their minds. End chapter.